What happens when an ordinary traffic stop becomes a life-changing encounter? A police officer's prejudiced assumptions clash with a reality he never anticipated. The person he's targeting happens to be the very individual who controls his professional destiny. The sun was beginning to set across Sacramento's streets, washing the evening sky in brilliant shades of gold and amber. Eric Porter found himself driving home, following an exhausting day at work, his car's engine purring quietly while he tweaked the climate control, anxious to leave behind the day's tensions. Soft music drifted from the radio, providing a peaceful counterpoint to the busy urban traffic around him. As he neared a yellow traffic signal, he decelerated just as it shifted to red. That's when the flashing blue and red emergency lights burst to life behind him, along with the piercing wail of a police siren. Eric caught sight of the patrol car in his mirror, his eyebrows drawing together slightly. He guided his vehicle to the roadside, lowering his window, while a police cruiser stopped behind him. Out emerged Officer Bradley Larson, somewhere in his mid-30s, sporting a military-style haircut and a shining badge across his uniform. Larson adjusted his duty belt as he approached Eric's vehicle with a swagger, projecting the assurance of someone accustomed to wielding authority. "License and registration," Larson stated tersely, his voice monotone, yet tinged with unmistakable command. Eric responded without protest, reaching toward his glove box for the registration while producing his driver's license. His actions remained measured and composed, though he sensed Larson's intense stare examining him, as though hunting for justification to probe further. "Are you aware why I stopped you?" Larson inquired, bending closer to the window. "I'm not completely certain," Eric answered calmly, his manner courteous yet resolute. "You failed to make a complete stop at that signal," Larson declared, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Eric's brow creased, but he gave a slight nod. "I understand. I believed I'd slowed sufficiently, but I get it." Larson remained silent for a moment. Instead, he hesitated, his gaze sharpening as he examined Eric more intently. This had evolved beyond a standard traffic stop, at least from Larson's perspective. His stance altered subtly yet perceptibly, suggesting he'd already concluded this involved more than a simple violation. The officer studied the license in his grip. "You're not local, are you?" he questioned. Eric paused briefly before responding. "I relocated here several months back. The address is right there on my license." But Larson wasn't genuinely paying attention. His inquiries were beginning to carry an undertone, sufficient to imply his concerns had moved beyond traffic infractions. Eric's composed bearing appeared to aggravate him, and he moved closer. "Where were you rushing off to?" "Simply heading home," Eric answered. His voice stayed level, but the subtle change in atmosphere was undeniable. Larson no longer viewed Eric merely as a motorist. He perceived something different, something that merited distrust. Eric sensed the mounting tension, yet he remained unfazed. Unknown to Officer Larson, that calm facade wasn't innocence, it was self-control. This was merely the opening act. Larson stepped backward, creasing Eric's paperwork with deliberate slowness before sliding them into his uniform pocket. He stood straighter, his expression transforming into something faintly superior, as if he'd already reached a conclusion about the individual before him. "Exit the vehicle," Larson commanded. Eric's fingers gripped the wheel momentarily tighter, but his expression revealed nothing. "Is there a particular reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone controlled. Larson's mouth twitched, though he concealed it swiftly. "I instructed you to get out of the car. You don't want to complicate this unnecessarily." The implied warning lingered in the air, unvoiced, yet crystal clear. Eric released a slow breath and opened his door. As he stepped outside, Larson's eyes swept over him, evaluating his appearance. Eric stood somewhat taller than the officer, his frame broad, yet his manner non-threatening. His well-fitted suit indicated professionalism. His polished footwear suggested someone precise and methodical, but none of these details seemed to register. Larson motioned toward the vehicle's front. "Keep your hands visible." Eric obliged, his movement steady and purposeful. "Is there something particular you're searching for, officer?" Larson's smirk was barely detectable. "Just standard procedure. We've experienced some problems in this area. You can never be overly cautious." Eric angled his head slightly, making eye contact with Larson. Problems involving businessmen in suits driving sedans? Or does this relate to something else entirely? The question struck like a blow, and momentarily, Larson's composure wavered. He straightened, his hand unconsciously moving toward his belt, more instinct than requirement. "Mind your attitude," he warned, his voice growing stern. "I'm merely asking a question," Eric responded. There was no rebellion in his tone, just a quiet determination that seemed to disturb the officer. Larson leaned nearer, his eyes narrowing. "You appear surprisingly knowledgeable about how these things work. Got something you're hiding?" Eric allowed the quiet to extend for a moment before replying. "No, officer. I simply value clarity regarding the purpose of an encounter like this. Transparency, you understand." Larson made a dismissive sound, but offered no response. He backed away, walking in a small circle before the car. The situation was evolving in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Eric wasn't responding as most individuals would. There was no anxiety, no stuttering, no nervous movement. Instead, there was command, grace, and a disturbing tranquility that unsettled Larson. "You seem quite sure of yourself," Larson muttered, almost under his breath, "as if you think you know what comes next." Eric didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head marginally. "Confidence isn't what's at stake here, officer. Respect is." Larson froze momentarily before turning to face him again. The smirk had vanished, replaced by something more pointed, almost defensive. He started to speak, but the words wouldn't emerge. Eric's composure was disrupting his equilibrium, and he resented it. As the silence lengthened, the friction between them felt charged, and Larson was beginning to understand this wouldn't unfold as he'd anticipated. Rather than retreat, however, he intensified his approach. The genuine challenge was about to commence. Larson drummed his fingers against the weapon holder on his belt, his irritation barely contained. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, particularly not by someone who resembled Eric. His attention returned to the sedan, as if seeking a rationale he hadn't yet created. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood," Larson ordered, his voice sharp. "I need to search for weapons." Eric's eyebrow lifted. "Weapons," he echoed, his tone skeptical, yet still measured. "Do I appear to be someone carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw clenched, and briefly his facade cracked. "I won't repeat myself." Eric hesitated, something unreadable flickering across his features. Then wordlessly, he turned and pressed his palms against his car's hood. Larson approached, the sound of his boots on pavement cutting through the tense silence. The officer searched Eric with quick, aggressive motions, his hands lingering longer than required. This wasn't merely a pat-down. It was an effort to establish dominance, to elicit a response. But Eric didn't react, didn't tense, didn't even shift under the intrusive examination. "You're clear," Larson grudgingly acknowledged, stepping back. The admission sounded reluctant, as though he was annoyed at finding nothing to validate his suspicions. Eric faced him, his expression serene, but his gaze keen. "Naturally I am," he stated simply. "Now, officer, if you're finished—" "I'm not finished," Larson cut him off, his voice escalating slightly. The words spilled out hastily, revealing his need to maintain authority. "You seem to understand plenty about what I can and cannot do. Want to explain why?" Eric crossed his arms, his posture relaxed despite the crackling tension. "I've had numerous encounters with law enforcement," he said. Let's just say I've gained considerable knowledge through the years. Larson's eyes narrowed. So, you're an attorney or something? Eric's smile was subtle. Or something. The vagueness of his response seemed to frustrate Larson even more. He moved closer, invading Eric's space, his voice dropping to nearly a growl. Listen, you think you're cleverer than me? Think you can smooth talk your way through this? Eric met his stare steadily, unwavering. I don't assume anything, officer. I simply believe in justice, and thus far, I'm not witnessing much of that here. The statement hung between them like a gauntlet, and Larson accepted the challenge. Justice? You believe justice is what this concerns? People like you always... He caught himself suddenly, the words lingering like vapor, though they hadn't fully escaped. Eric's expression remained unchanged, but something in his bearing shifted, a subtle yet unmistakable indication that he'd grasped exactly what Larson had left unspoken. People like me, Eric repeated, his voice quiet, but loaded with significance. Larson bristled, retreating as if recognizing he'd just crossed a boundary he couldn't uncross. You understand what I mean? He mumbled, though his tone lacked the certainty it had possessed moments before. I believe I do, Eric replied softly. His calmness was no longer passive. It was razor-edged, slicing through the pretense like a knife. And I think we both recognize this interaction ceased being about a traffic violation quite some time ago. Larson opened his mouth to respond, but no words emerged. For the first time, he appeared uncertain, as though he wasn't entirely sure how to continue. The power dynamic was shifting, and for the first time, Larson stood on unstable ground. But the moment of truth was yet to arrive, and it would be one he'd never forget. Eric's voice cut through the heavy silence, steady and unwavering. Officer, I believe it's time you learned who I am. Larson's brow furrowed, his irritation returning. I don't care who you are, he snapped back, though the slight tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm retrieving my badge, he said calmly, observing Larson's hand twitch near his holster. No need for dramatics. I want you to see this. The words hung there, heavy with unspoken meaning. Larson's eyes tracked Eric's hand as he withdrew a leather wallet and opened it, revealing a gleaming badge. Eric Porter, Eric said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. Chief of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson went rigid. His eyes jumped between the badge and Eric's face, searching for any indication this was some kind of joke, but there was no amusement in Eric's expression, only quiet authority and a trace of disappointment. Internal Affairs, Larson repeated, his voice breaking slightly. Yes, Eric interrupted, sparing him the difficulty of completing the thought. I supervise officer behavior. My role is to ensure that those wearing this badge maintain the integrity and principles it's supposed to represent. Larson's face drained of color, his confident demeanor crumbling in real time. He took a small step backward, his hand dropping from his belt as if the weight of his own authority had suddenly become unbearable. Eric moved forward, closing the distance Larson had instinctively created. Do you know what's been the most disturbing aspect of this encounter, Officer Larson? He asked, his voice calm but penetrating. Larson couldn't answer. He looked like someone who had just realized he'd stepped into quicksand with no idea how to escape. It's not the profiling, Eric continued, though that's troubling enough. It's not the unfounded escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were addressing. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you've sworn to uphold. And why? Larson's mouth opened, but no sound came. Eric's gaze pierced him, relentless. Because I didn't match your notion of someone deserving respect, Eric concluded for him. His words weren't angry, but they carried the force of an accusation. And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter while wearing this uniform. Larson's shoulders dropped slightly, the full impact of Eric's words settling squarely on him. He glanced down at the badge in Eric's hand again, as if it might somehow vanish if he didn't look too closely. Eric stepped back, giving Larson space to breathe, but his voice maintained its edge. "Here's what will happen," he said. "You're going to step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about your next words." Larson's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly weighing whether to resist or comply. The hesitation cost him, and Eric added, his voice lowering slightly, "You'll be hearing from me again. Not as a driver, you stopped roadside, but as the person responsible for determining whether you're suitable to wear that badge." Larson swallowed hard, his face reddening as the gravity of the situation sank in. He reached into his chest pocket and extracted Eric's license and registration, his hands shaking slightly as he handed them over. Eric accepted them without comment, placing them in his wallet. He moved toward his car's driver door, pausing with one hand on the handle. He looked back over his shoulder, meeting Larson's gaze one final time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said. "The badge doesn't make you superior to anyone. It makes you answerable to everyone." As Eric settled back into his car and started the engine, Larson remained standing in the diminishing light, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was far from over. His next action would send ripples throughout the entire department. The drive home was silent, but Eric's thoughts were anything but. The encounter replayed in his mind, not because it was unusual, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had dealt with like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time would be different. This time, Eric possessed the authority to take action. The following morning, Eric sat at his desk, early sunlight filtering through his office blinds at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file lay open before him, Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't clean. Minor complaints about unprofessional behavior, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly investigated. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled as he considered the broader implications. Larson wasn't an exception. He was a symptom of a deeper issue, and Eric had no interest in applying a temporary fix to a serious wound. A tap on his office door broke his concentration. His assistant, Linda, entered carrying a stack of reports. "Good morning, Mr. Porter. I have the summary of last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about the departmental review next week." Eric nodded, accepting the files from her. "Thank you, Linda. Could you also arrange a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda paused, detecting the gravity in Eric's tone. "Certainly," she said before leaving the room. Eric returned his attention to Larson's file, but his focus extended beyond just this officer. This was larger than one person and one incident. It concerned the culture that allowed someone like Larson to feel justified in his actions. And if Eric understood anything, it was that culture began at the leadership level. Later that afternoon, Eric sat opposite Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with graying hair and a straightforward manner, leaned back in his chair, listening carefully as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have dismissed it as just another poor interaction," Eric said, his voice steady but determined. "But that would have been wrong. Larson's conduct isn't an isolated case. It reflects how much progress we still need to make." Daniels massaged his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has surfaced," he admitted. "But we've always managed it internally, discreetly. "And that's the issue," Eric replied. "Discretion doesn't solve anything. Discretion allows it to continue. It's time to be open about this." Daniel studied him, the weight of the conversation evident in his expression. "What are you suggesting?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without pause. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our procedures, our accountability measures. We can't keep ignoring this. If we don't hold ourselves to higher standards, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to upset people with this approach." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's past time someone did." The following weeks were a blur of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked relentlessly, gathering data, speaking with officers, and conducting public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for transformation, a pivotal moment that forced the department to face its shortcomings directly. Larson, meanwhile, faced an internal hearing. Eric made no attempt to hide his involvement, sitting across from Larson during the proceedings and observing as the officer squirmed under examination. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric understood the real success wasn't in punishing Larson. It was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at the podium during a community gathering, addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. He spoke not of fault, but of responsibility, of the shared obligation to create a system that served everyone. His words weren't merely a demand for accountability, they were a commitment to change. "Justice isn't only about apprehending criminals," Eric said, his voice carrying through the hall. "It's about ensuring that those sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for every person they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here together." The applause was overwhelming, but Eric didn't dwell on it. For him, this wasn't the conclusion of the story. It was the start of a better one. As Eric stepped down from the podium, he surveyed the faces in the audience, some doubtful, some optimistic, but all listening. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen. And for now, that was sufficient. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's begin the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right.